My name is Yves. I'm from Quebec. I purchased my Alberg 30, which I named Jean du Sud, in 1973. That was 37 years ago. I've been using it ever since for cruising. The first year I purchased it, I sailed it to the West Indies and then back up again. And I made that trip between the East Coast and or between Quebec and the West Indies 4 or 5 times maybe. The last time I didn't come back to Quebec, I sailed across the Atlantic to Europe, cruised to Sweden, then back to Brittany. And eventually I made the project of sailing it around the world because I knew the boat was strong enough and it wanted as much as I did to go places. And I was in Quebec, and I was in Brittany and I wanted to sail back to Quebec, but I didn't want to get there right away, so I went the wrong way around the world. As I came out of the English Channel, instead of going west across the Atlantic, I turned left and sailed all the way down the Atlantic, and at the Cape of Good Hope I turned left again, sailed across the Indian Ocean, south of Australia, across the Pacific Ocean, and the last left turn was at Cape Horn. And from there I sailed back north to Quebec. It took 282 sailing days, and I sailed 28,200 miles, which averages exactly at 100 miles a day. That's including the calm I had and the time I spent under jury rig or under no rig at all, because at one point I was capsized and dismasted in the Southern Ocean. Even though before I left I had attempted to make a mast that would be capsize proof, I knew that if I went sailing in those latitudes with the original mast, which was strong enough to stay up as long as it didn't get wet, but I knew that if the mast got wet and went into the water, it may not resist a capsize. And for that reason I changed the whole mast, made a mast that was quite a bit stronger, heavier, with a double spreader rig. I beefed up the rigging from a 1/4 inch to 7 millimeter. And I made a mistake of not replacing or increasing the size of the bolts holding the lower shroud chain plates to the hull. The original lower shrouds were 3/16. I changed everything to 7 millimeter. And I figured that the shear strength of 3/4 inch bolts would be equal to the tensile strength of 7 millimeter cable, but obviously it was not. And as I was capsized, 6 of them, I think, for the 2 lowers on one side, the bolts snapped and the chain plates pulled out of the deck, and that's the reason the mast broke. So I had to stop in the Chatham Islands in the Pacific Ocean, about 600 miles from Australia. And I eventually spliced the mast, set it up again, and finished the voyage. I had the choice between 2 boats. One was called the Classic 30, which had a shape very similar to the Alberg 30. And the other one was an Alberg 30, which was for sale on Lake Ontario. And I preferred the Alberg 30 because of its reputation. And in using it, I realized that this boat was an excellent boat and a very good seagoing boat. The first time I sailed it to the West Indies, I left late. I left in Montreal or Lake Champlain in November, sailed down, and I didn't take off from Beaufort to sail to St. Martin until the first days of December. And I met very rough weather. The wind was from dead ahead, 4, 7 or 8, and I didn't have any experience, and I didn't want to sail a longer route, so I would tack on the wind shift and sailed very close to the wind, and I was pounding like hell. And I remember telling myself, hey, a boat needs to be built very strong to go offshore. Of course, this was the roughest, except for the Southern Ocean, the roughest passage I ever made. That was my first passage. But the boat withstood it gallantly. Only damage I got was that the 2 gussets to which the forward shrouds, lower shrouds were attached, delaminated from the hull. They were too short. I eventually, because the gusset goes only between the shelf and the deck, and it's about this high, this high. So I made a new gusset, and I made it go through the shelf to have a much longer bonding surface, and that's an advice I would give any Albert 30 owner. I would still choose the Albert 30 nowadays, especially the price has gone down a bit. When my boat was new, it sold for $10,000. When I bought it, I paid $15,000. That was the market price 5 years later. And at one point, Albert 30s would sell $30,000. But then the price came down again, and now they go for between 10 and 15. And in a boat this size, you can't get a better deal. And to me, it's the ideal cruising boat because it's big enough and strong enough to sail around Cape Horn, but it's also small enough to be hauled on the road on a trailer. And I built a trailer for that boat. The beam, 30-foot boat nowadays are much beamier. This one is relatively narrow. Of course, you have less space below. But the maximum beam you can carry on a trailer without a special permit is 8'6". The Albert 30 is 8'9". My trailer is 8 feet. I've never been bothered by the extra 3 inches. And I hauled the boat from Montreal to Georgian Bay, to Halifax. 1 year I hauled it to St. John, New Brunswick, sailed down the St. John River, sailed down along the coast as far as here, as far as Annapolis. And at the boat show, Eric came with the trailer. We picked up the boat here and hauled it back to Oka. And a boat that can travel at 40 knots on the road is a big plus. Before I became a self-steering manufacturer, or before that a sail bum, I had been an actor. My professional training is in a theater school as an actor. And I worked as an actor for 10 years, maybe. Then I went in film. I worked as a first assistant director in film. And eventually I wanted to be a director, but I also wanted to go sailing badly. And I understood that in art, if you want to achieve something meaningful or something important, you have to devote all your your energy to the project. And my energy went more towards going sailing. And I realized that if I didn't go, I was condemned to play second fiddle in art. And I went sailing. Eventually, I made this project of sailing around the world. I wanted to go non-stop and alone. And since I'd been an actor and a filmmaker, I figured, well, the best way, a good way of finding the money for the trip would be to shoot a film, as I would sail around the world. For 2 years, I prepared the boat, did all I could, which didn't need any money, to prepare the boat. I built a new mast. I had access to a yard that built aluminum center borders, so I could have the fittings welded. I bought the tube and I made the masthead, mast step, and spreader fittings myself. But eventually I needed money to buy sails, which I couldn't sew myself, and some other equipment, radio equipment and so on. And I went back to Quebec and tried to find $20,000 to pay for that material, which I couldn't fabricate myself. And I figured that the money I would find to shoot a film would also pay for the expenses of the trip. That was being very naive, because given the seafaring culture in Quebec, when I told people that I was going to go sail alone around the world on a 30-foot boat, and around Cape Horn, they thought I was mad. When I added that I wanted to shoot a feature-length film during that voyage, they thought I was even madder. Because a film shot by the same person who's both behind and in front of the camera had never been done before, even ashore. So let alone on a small boat on the ocean nowadays with digital filmmaking, as you're doing. It's a very easy matter, but then that was 30 years ago. This didn't exist. And I was shooting 16 millimeter film with sound recorded separately on a tape recorder. Eventually, in exchange of radio broadcast on the ham frequencies and picked up by ham radio operator in Montreal, who was very skilled and had a huge pivoting antenna, and he would get up at 4 or 5:30 in the morning when the propagation opened to pick up my signal before it would be drowned by other operators. So he was able to pick up my signal because I had only a 100-watt transmitter on the boat. And he would pick up my signal, relay it by phone patch to a radio station, and it was broadcast every morning, a short report. And they gave me $20,000 for that, and they made a profit by selling advertising because there was a big peak of audience at that time. Financing the film was a different matter. I was known in Quebec as an actor and a filmmaker, and some people who were interested in sailing at Radio Canada decided that I deserved to be given the benefit of the doubt. And they said, if you shoot a film, we'll broadcast it. But we won't give you the money for it. We'll give it to a producer, because we want to make sure we get the film in exchange of the money. And finding the producer was much more difficult. And eventually I was able to find one, but he would give me a small camera, and I had just a few reels of 100-foot 16mm film at a rendezvous, as I was not stopping, of course, and sailing off Madeira, I met another sailboat who was stopping in Madeira, and in mid-ocean we came close together, and I threw him the first 6 reels I had shot, and a few reels of sound also, which he mailed to Montreal. It was developed, and they knew that I could shoot film on the boat. And at Cape of Good Hope, I met the crew offshore and gave them what I had shot between Madeira and Cape of Good Hope, and they gave me much more film stock, because he knew that he wouldn't lose his shirt if he spent money buying film. And I had very, very little film to spend. And during the first part 1 of the film, from the moment I left to the stop at the Chatham Islands, I shot 36 reels of film, of 100-foot film, and part 1 is 1,800 feet. So I shot less than 2 to 1. Nowadays, you would shoot 100 to 1. And I would do 1 take. I knew I couldn't do more than, couldn't waste any film stock. So I would do 1 take. I would shoot only when the light was good and when I had something meaningful to narrate, and would do 1 take. For the second leg, I had the better budget, and I had the helmet camera, and I had more equipment, but I shot 4 to 1. And in the beginning, I would improvise to the camera and just tell what was happening. As the voyage progressed, I realized that there was this that I want to talk about, and I hadn't said anything about being alone or about whatever. And I would write the scenes to give a maximum of information in a minimum of words, learn it by heart, and deliver it to the camera as if it was improvised. I've been an actor. To be able to best describe and sum up the experience. The film was very well received. Actually, it won the grand prize of all the film festivals it competed in 7 film festivals, except 2 festivals where it didn't win the grand prize. One was a film festival in Houston, Texas. I won silver. And there was, in my category alone, there was more than 160 entries. The other festival I didn't win grand prize was a film festival in Portugal. And in that festival I entered the full-length version, an hour and a half. So I was competing against feature-length films shot in 35 millimeters with crews and cameras and script and so on. And I didn't get the grand prize of that film festival, but I still got a prize from that festival. But all the other festivals, I came up with gold, including the La Rochelle Sailing Film Festival. I won the gold for part 1, and 2 years later I won gold again for part 2 of my film. I was in Montreal trying to find the money for the film, and I happened to walk past a shop that sold kites. And I had this idea, well, could it be, because I wanted to take the camera out of the boat, of course, to film the boat from a distance. So I went in and I asked the attendant at the shop, do you think it's possible to send the camera up under a kite? He said, yes. Actually, I have a magazine here about kites and about aerial photography. Of course, it was not film, it was only photography, about aerial photography under kites. And in the article there was the name of a photographer from Quebec, near Montreal. So I called him and asked him how he did it. And he gave me all the information I needed. He even gave me the kites. He gave me 2 kites. And this was planned from the start. And the camera, I flew up on a kite, in the kite, was very small. It was a camera that my father had bought the year I was born to shoot home movies. He had bought that in Europe. It was a very small 16 millimeter Cine Kodak magazine camera, very small, that took 50-foot reels, 50-foot cassettes, which I sent up the kite. And I had figured that I would shoot that scene. To fly a kite from a boat, you have to receive the wind from forward of the beam. Because if you're downwind, of course, you can't fly a kite, because the foredeck will be blanketed by the sails and there won't be any wind, and you need an apparent wind that's strong enough. And I had figured that I would shoot this scene as I would be in the northeast trade winds towards the end of the voyage, with the wind forward of the beam, and I could fly the kite from the stern deck, and the apparent wind would be strong enough. And that's how I did the scene. I had a radio-controlled, my brother flew model airplanes, and he gave me his radio control, and that's how I had planned to stop and start the camera. But by the time I did the trip, the batteries of this radio control went dead, and I didn't have any means of recharging them, and I had to find a solution to start the camera. I tried various things, a string. First you fly the kite, and when the kite is in stable air, then you attach the camera to the line, and you just feed more line, and the camera goes up, hopefully. But I needed, and of course, since the line is pointing to the boat, if the camera is pointing in the direction of the line, it'll be pointing at the boat. But I needed to find a way of starting the camera, and I fiddled with some wires and rubber bands and so on. And I made the mistake of not making a shot of that mechanism. It's not in the film. From the helmet camera, just showing how the camera was triggered. And so I would fold a piece of paper in an accordion in the shape of an accordion, clip that on the line, and the wind would blow it up along the line, and it would hit and trigger the mechanism. That's how I started the camera. I lost a kite. Actually, I made a couple shots, which were, I didn't know, because with video you can watch it right away, but I didn't know how it looked like, what I had done. I knew later. But at one point, the kite fell in the water, and I was able to retrieve it that time and pick it up. And actually the line, it went around my leg, and I don't know if I still have the scar, but the line burned the skin as it was coming out of the bucket that was stowed in, and it hurt quite a bit. But I was able to pick up the kite and repair it with fiberglass. But then the kite was not balanced anymore, and it was too big to check the balance of the kite aboard the boat. There was always wind, I couldn't do that. And then I tried to make more scenes, and I flew the kite, and being unbalanced, and it fell in the water. And I went by to try to pick it up. A couple times, by the time I would leave the tiller and go reach over the boat, it was out of reach. And the third time, I did that 3 or 4 times, and the fourth time I lost sight of it. So then I had the idea of climbing up the mast with a helmet camera to try to look around, and it made a very dramatic scene in the film of the loss of my toy and then going up the mast with the camera on the head to look for it. I've been sailing for 50 years now, and as soon as I started sailing, I started looking for a way of having my boat steer itself. On my first boat was a 24-footer, and I built a self-steering gear for that boat inspired by the Hassler principle with a servo pendulum and a vertical axis vane. It worked. It allowed me to do my first single-handed passage between Gaspé and the Madeleine Islands, 150 miles alone. Then I bought the Albert 30, and right away I made another self-steering gear for it. The boat came with a wheel, so I figured that I would build an auxiliary rudder on the back and controlled by a horizontal axis vane, which I did, and it steered the boat to the West Indies and a couple times back and forth and then across the Atlantic. But it kept the course, but it was not quick enough. And it made me conclude that it was much better to steer through the boat's rudder. That's why it's there in the first place. And to do the circumnavigation, I knew I needed a super heavy-duty self-steering gear, because all the other boats, other sailors who had sailed that route, except maybe Moitessier, experienced problems with their self-steering gear. That was the most important and the most critical piece of equipment of the whole voyage. And I had already designed 2 gears. I figured that I could design one that would stand through a round-the-world voyage. And I worked on that for over a period of a few years, would amount to add up as a total, the equivalent of 1 year full time, only on the design and testing of various systems. And I finally came up, and I wanted to simplify, make it simple and strong and so on. And I came up with a very simple mechanism, which I'm quite proud of, and which I will show you. The main technical problem you have to solve when you design a self-steering gear is to transform the up and down movement of a connecting rod that comes from the vane, which detects the course variation, into the rotating movement of the servo pendulum that provides the muscle to turn the boat's rudder, rotating movement that will cancel itself as the servo pendulum tilts, so that the tilt of the servo pendulum and rudder angle is proportional to the tilt of the vane and course variation. I tried all sorts of mechanism. Nowadays it's made on other competing self-steering gears. They have bronze bearings. And I came up with this small bent wire, piece of bent wire. You see, this is horizontal here. And the connecting rod is connected here at the end of this crank, moves up and down. And if you look like this, you see that as this pivots, it turns this here. And this segment passes through the stock of the servo pendulum. That's the stock of the servo pendulum. As it turns, as it moves, as the crank moves up and down, it turns the stock, and the water flow will push the stock sideways until it is in line fore and aft again, so that the tilt of the servo pendulum is proportional to the tilt of the vane and course variation. Simple mechanism made with a bent 1/4 inch rod. Just a press and you're in business.